before Europe was drowned in fire, before kingdoms collapsed and millions died. There was a moment, a fragile, trembling moment where peace still held. A moment when ambassadors whispered warnings ignored by kings, when religious tensions simmered like gunpowder under the floorboards, and when the smallest spark could end an age. This is the story of the final days before the 30 Years' War, the last breaths of a continent on the edge of self-destruction. In the early 1600s, Europe looked calm on the surface. Harvests were good, trade was thriving, and the great powers signed treaties promising cooperation. But beneath that thin layer of civility, everything was rotting. Two worldviews, Catholic and Protestant, were colliding. Rival dynasties plotted in silence. Emperors, generals, and princes made secret pacts that contradicted the treaties they signed in public. And in the heart of Central Europe, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, a political crisis was about to detonate, a crisis so explosive that once unleashed, it would burn for 30 relentless years and reshape the modern world. Today, we step into that moment. The last calm sunrise before the continent descended into its bloodiest conflict. Before we dive in, if you love deep dive historical storytelling, the kind that unravels the drama, the strategy, and the human cost behind history's biggest turning points, make sure to hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and like this video so more people can discover it. Now, let's go back to where the end began. If you stood in the heart of Europe in the early 1600s, one truth was impossible to ignore. Europe was split spiritually, politically, and emotionally. A century earlier, the Protestant Reformation had torn Christianity apart. Nations, cities, and even families found themselves choosing sides between Catholics, loyal to Rome, Lutherans, rejecting papal authority, Calvinists, demanding even deeper reform, and dozens of smaller regional sects. That religious fracture overlapped with politics in every possible direction. Princes sought independence from emperors, kings meddled in the affairs of rival states, and the great dynasties, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Vases, eyed one another like predators circling a wounded animal. At the center of it all stood the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling patchwork of 1,000 territories in Central Europe. It wasn't a country. It wasn't an empire in the modern sense. It was, as one historian famously put it, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But it was the powder keg in which the war would ignite. And the man sitting on top of that powder keg, Emperor Matthias Habsburg, old, childless, politically exhausted, and presiding over a rapidly fracturing realm. The peace that remained in Europe depended on the ability of old Matthias to hold his empire together, and the willingness of his neighbors to leave him alone. Neither, as it turned out, would last. If you wanted to find Europe's most dangerous fault line in 1617, you wouldn't look to France, not to Spain, not even to the Netherlands. You would look to Bohemia, modern-day Czechia. Bohemia was a kingdom with a majority Protestant population, ruled by a Catholic dynasty, a kingdom that valued independence, ruled by emperors who demanded obedience, a kingdom with its own political traditions, ruled by outsiders who saw it only as territory to be controlled. For decades, Bohemia had lived under a delicate balance. Protestants and Catholics shared an easy coexistence, protected by a legal document called the Letter of Majesty, which granted religious freedoms. But by 1617, the balance was cracking. Catholic nobles pushed to limit Protestant rights. Protestant nobles pushed back harder. Every minor dispute became a test of power. Into this boiling environment stepped Ferdinand of Styria, a man whose beliefs made moderates on both sides nervous. Where many rulers were pragmatic or flexible, Ferdinand was not. He was passionate. He was devout. He was uncompromising. A man raised by Jesuits, shaped by Counter-Reformation fire, and dedicated to restoring Catholic dominance across his lands. And in 1617, he was chosen controversially as the next king of Bohemia. To the Protestants of Bohemia, this was the equivalent of placing a wolf in charge of a flock of sheep. To Ferdinand, it was the first step in a long-awaited crusade. And to Europe, it was the beginning of the end. The appointment of Ferdinand did not immediately trigger war, but it triggered something else: fear. Fear whispers more loudly than any proclamation. It travels faster than letters. It spreads further than armies. In taverns across Prague, commoners whispered that their new king would ban Protestant worship. In noble estates, families feared their churches would be torn down. Merchants feared religious restrictions would cripple trade. Clergy feared they would be purged in a wave of violence. And Ferdinand did nothing to ease the tension. He rarely visited Bohemia. He rarely spoke to Protestant nobles. He rarely reassured anyone. Instead, he quietly began replacing Protestant officials with Catholic loyalists. Each appointment was small, each change seemed minor, but the message was unmistakable. The Protestants of Bohemia began to feel something every minority fears, not an attack, but the sense that an attack was coming. By early 1618, the situation was growing critical. Bohemian Protestant leaders gathered in Prague to discuss an urgent question. Should they take action now, or wait and hope for mercy later? History has shown that fearful majorities and fearful minorities make terrible combinations. Fear drives people to overreact. Fear convinces people that small changes are existential threats. And fear makes compromise feel impossible. In the spring of 1618, a group of Protestant nobles decided that waiting was no longer an option. Ferdinand's governors, Catholic officials appointed to enforce imperial policy, had begun enforcing new restrictions on Protestant worship in 2 Bohemian towns. Churches were threatened with closure. Local Protestant leaders were arrested or removed from office. To the Protestants of Bohemia, these were not isolated incidents. These were test cases, a sign of what Ferdinand intended to do across the entire kingdom once he gained more power. So the nobles resolved to take a bold step. They would confront the governors directly at Prague Castle. Their goal? Demand that the restrictions be reversed. Demand that the letter of majesty be respected. Demand that Bohemian autonomy be protected. What they expected was a tense negotiation. What they delivered was a spark that lit Europe on fire. May 23, 1618, Prague Castle. What happened on this day has been recounted 1,000 times, but rarely with the emphasis it deserves. The Protestant nobles arrived not as hesitant diplomats, but as determined men prepared for dramatic action. Their meeting with the Catholic governors Yaroslav Borta of Martinis and Vilhelm Slavata began with shouted accusations, angry gestures, and political threats. The governors refused to yield. The Protestants refused to back down. And in the chaos that followed, someone shouted words that would echo through history. Throw them out the window. In a moment that defied both law and sanity, the nobles seized the governors and hurled them from a 3rd-story window nearly 70 feet high. This act, the defenestration of Prague, has been called everything from political theatre to attempted murder to divine comedy. The governors survived, landing in a pile of refuse, which Protestants said was dumb luck, and Catholics insisted was a miracle. But the true impact was not physical, it was symbolic. A line had been crossed. This was open rebellion. This was treason. This was the moment the final days of peace ended and the first days of war began. When word of the defenestration reached Emperor Matthias, the old ruler was overwhelmed. He was already ill, already tired, already struggling to contain factional disputes within his own government. Now his empire was in open revolt. Matthias faced an impossible decision. Launch a rapid military response, a war he was not prepared to fight, or attempt negotiation, a move that would embolden rebellions elsewhere. And looming over him, like a shadow, was Ferdinand, his designated heir, demanding that the rebellion be crushed with decisive force. Matthias hesitated. He drafted letters. He convened councils. He prayed for guidance. But he failed to act. That hesitation created a vacuum, a space in which radical forces on both sides flourished. What followed in the months after the defenestration is less well known than the dramatic moment itself, but it is here in the slow, smoldering aftermath that Europe descended deeper into chaos. Bohemian rebels sent envoys across Protestant Europe seeking allies. Catholic rulers debated whether to intervene on Ferdinand's behalf. Mercenaries across the continent sensed opportunity and began offering their services to whichever side would hire them. In taverns and marketplaces, ordinary citizens whispered that the war had already begun even before the first battle was fought, and that whisper grew louder with each passing week. In the streets, blacksmiths forged weapons, nobles hired bodyguards, farmers hid their harvests, priests preached sermons filled with fear and fire. Every action signaled the same truth. Europe was preparing for war. The war might have been avoided perhaps if Matthias had lived longer. He had been a moderating force, an old man weary of conflict, a ruler who still valued the fragile threads of peace. But in March 1619, Matthias died, and with his death, the final restraint on Ferdinand vanished. Ferdinand was now emperor, king of Bohemia, master of a vast Habsburg domain, and he was determined to crush the Bohemian rebellion without mercy. But just as Ferdinand assumed power, the rebels made their boldest move yet. Few events in early modern Europe were as shocking as what happened next. The Bohemian rebels declared that Ferdinand had forfeited the throne. They rejected him as king, and in his place, They elected Frederick V of the Palatinate, a young Protestant ruler known to his critics as the Winter King for reasons that would soon become painfully prophetic. Frederick was idealistic, ambitious, and disastrously unprepared, but his acceptance of the Bohemian crown escalated the conflict from a regional rebellion to a continental crisis. Because Frederick's choice forced every major power in Europe to take sides. Spain backed Ferdinand, the Dutch backed Frederick, France hesitated then prepared for intervention. Sweden watched, Denmark watched, and the Catholic League and Protestant Union sharpened their swords. The final days of peace were over. Europe was mobilizing for the greatest war it had ever seen. The first official armies began assembling in late 1619. War is not only waged by soldiers. It is waged on families, on civilians, on ordinary people who want nothing more than to survive. In the months before the first great battle, a quiet exodus swept across Central Europe. Peasants fled to forests. Merchants abandoned caravans. Villagers hid their grain in cellars and caves. Parents sent children to live with relatives in safer regions. On the roads, streams of refugees carried their belongings in carts, sacks, and trembling arms. Their fear was not misplaced. The armies of this coming war would not be professional national forces bound by strict discipline. They would be mercenaries hungry, unpaid, and unpredictable. Europe as civilians understood the truth long before the generals did. The 30 Years' War would not be fought only on battlefields. It would be fought everywhere. Across the Holy Roman Empire, recruitment notices appeared overnight. Men were offered pay, plunder, and the promise of glory. Some joined for religion, some for money. Some simply because war was the only life they knew. Mercenaries from Germany, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands flocked to battlefields that had not yet been drawn on any map. And as Ferdinand's Catholic forces marched toward Bohemia, the rebels knew their days were numbered unless they secured foreign support. They begged England for aid. They pleaded with the Dutch. They petitioned the German Protestant princes. But alliances formed slowly. Armies marched quickly. Bohemia was running out of time. By the autumn of 1620, tensions reached a breaking point. Ferdinand's forces, led by skilled generals and backed by Spanish money, were closing in on Prague. Bohemian resistance was fracturing. Frederick's leadership was faltering. Foreign allies hesitated to fully commit. And the rebels faced a grim reality. They would stand alone. In early November, Ferdinand's Catholic armies advanced toward the slopes of a hill west of Prague, a hill known as White Mountain. Here, Europe's final days of peace would end, and its bloodiest conflict would truly begin. The Battle of White Mountain was not long. It was not glorious. It was not evenly matched. But it was decisive. On November 8, 1620, the Catholic army smashed the Bohemian forces in less than 2 hours. 2 hours that reshaped Europe for centuries. Prague fell soon after. Frederick fled, earning his nickname the Winter King because he ruled for just one winter. The rebellion collapsed, and Ferdinand began a brutal program of re-Catholicization, political purges, and executions. Europe watched in horror, but instead of peace, the victory at White Mountain triggered the next even larger phase of the conflict. Foreign powers now saw the Habsburg triumph as a threat to their own interests, and one by one, they entered the war. What followed White Mountain was not a conclusion. It was an explosion. Denmark entered the war, then Sweden, then France. Each intervention escalated the conflict. Each army brought new destruction. Each year brought deeper suffering. What began as a local rebellion spiraled into a continental catastrophe. Famine followed armies like a shadow. Plague spread through devastated villages. Crops burned. Cities starved. Millions died. The last days of peace had vanished into memory, and Europe would not know peace again for 30 long, brutal years. Looking back, historians often ask, could the 30 Years' War have been prevented? Could a different emperor, a different decision, a different negotiation have preserved peace? Perhaps, but the final days of peace reveal a deeper truth. Europe did not fall into war because of one act, not because of one defenestration, not because of one king. It fell because fear replaced trust, because factions replaced unity, because compromise became impossible, because men in power chose ambition over restraint. The 30 Years' War was not inevitable until the moment it was, and the lesson it leaves behind is haunting. Peace is not lost in a single moment. It is lost slowly in whispers, in rumors, in politics, in fear long before the cannons fire. This has been Europe's bloodiest 30-year conflict, the final days of peace, a story of tension, hesitation, ambition, and tragedy, the final breaths of a continent on the brink. If you found this journey into the past compelling, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of Europe's turbulent history. And if you want to dive even deeper, drop a comment below telling me which moment in the lead up to the war shocked you the most, or which part of the 30 Years' War you want covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.